The garden behind the inn glowed under lantern light. It was not a nobleman's estate, nor a governor's hall. It was simply beautiful in the way honest things were beautiful. Carefully chosen, carefully built, paid for with labor instead of inheritance. Elias Whitford stood beneath the rose arbor with one hand inside his coat, fingers resting against the velvet box hidden there. For that one fragile moment, he was no longer the owner of hotels from Boston to Charleston, nor the merchant watched too closely by powerful men. He was only a man about to ask the woman he had loved for years to become his wife. Clara had been part of his life too long to feel like a sudden romance. She had known him when he was still poor, still unknown, still fighting for a place in a world that preferred men like him to remain invisible. She had stood beside him through years of work, hunger, and stubborn hope. She had loved him before the success, and Elias had loved her just as long. She walked toward him now, smiling softly. "You sent everyone away," she said. "That usually means you are about to do something dangerous." "For once," Elias said, "I intend to do something honest." She stopped in front of him, studying his face. "You look more nervous than the day you opened your first hotel." "I was less afraid that day." Clara laughed softly. "That is a lie. You were pale as a ghost and twice as proud. And you stayed anyway." "I always stayed." The words landed between them with the quiet weight of truth. For a moment, neither of them said anything. They did not need to. Years of hunger, work, late nights, and hard-earned victories already lived in the silence between them. Then Elias drew the velvet box from his coat. The smile faded from her lips, replaced by a tenderness so sudden it nearly undid him. He went down on one knee, and for the first time that evening, all the certainty he showed the rest of the world left him. "Clara," he said, "you have stood beside me through every year that mattered. When I had nothing, you did not turn away. Whatever good has come of my life, it carries your handprint. I do not want another future that does not have you in it. Will you marry me?" Her eyes filled before he finished. "Yes," she whispered. Then, with a laugh, "Yes, Elias, of course I will." His fingers shook as he took the ring from the box and slid it onto her hand. For one perfect second, it seemed the world had stopped for them alone. The gold caught the lantern light. Clara looked down at it, then back at him, her face shining with joy as she bent toward him. And Elias heard it. A faint sound from the dark. Too slight for most men to notice, but Elias had not survived the streets, kitchens, and counting rooms by failing to hear danger when it breathed. His head snapped up, a flash in the shadows. Then the bullet tore through his chest. The force hurled him backward. Clara screamed his name. The ring slipped from her finger, struck the stone, and rolled into a crack between the paving slabs, still glinting beneath the lantern light as blood spread across his shirt. Clara dropped to her knees beside him, one hand pressing desperately against the wound. "No, Elias, stay with me!" He tried to answer, but blood filled his mouth. Beyond the arbor, shapes moved in the dark. Boots on gravel. Men coming closer to make certain the work was finished. Clara turned at once and threw herself over him, as if her body could shield him from the next shot. Then another gunshot split the night, and another. Even through the roaring pain in his chest, Elias heard them. He could no longer lift his head, could no longer see clearly. But somewhere through the blur of lantern light and blood and Clara's broken voice, those extra shots tore through the darkness with a meaning more terrible than anything his fading body could bear. No, not her. The garden began to dim. Clara's voice dimmed. The men in the shadows dimmed. And in those drowning seconds, as terror and grief closed around him together, his mind fell backward, clear and sudden, into memory. Back before the hotels. Back before the money. Back before Clara's trembling yes beneath the lanterns. Back to cold streets, hunger, mud, and a bundle of newspapers tucked beneath one thin arm. Back to the boy he had once been, barefoot, hungry, running through the morning streets, believing that if he listened hard enough to the world, one day he would learn how to beat it. Before Elias Whitford became a man people envied, he was a boy people barely saw. He was born to a poor farming family, on land that gave them more stones than grain. In good months they survived. In bad months they pretended they had merely eaten already. Hunger was not an event in Elias's childhood. It was a season that kept returning, wearing different faces. By the time he was old enough to carry weight without falling, he worked. At dawn, he sold newspapers in the streets. In winter, the cold bit through his sleeves before sunrise. In summer, sweat ran down his spine before the city had fully awakened. His shoes wore through so often that there were weeks he went barefoot and learned to step around sharp stone by instinct. Some mornings he shouted headlines with an empty stomach and felt the words scraping out of him like something borrowed. But poverty gave him one advantage rich boys never had. It made him invisible. No one lowered their voice for a newspaper boy. Men discussed shipping delays, lawsuits, debts, tax levies, and private feuds while tossing him a coin without looking at his face. Gentlemen spoke freely in coffee houses. Clerks argued on courthouse steps. Dock workers cursed over cargo tallies. Gamblers boasted. Drunkards complained. Swindlers slipped and said too much. Elias listened. That was how his real education began. He learned that money did not simply belong to the men who had it. It moved. It hid. It changed hands on paper before it changed hands in truth. He learned that respectable men lied with better grammar than thieves. He learned that a signature could ruin a family faster than a knife. He learned that the wealthy did not win because they were wiser by nature. Often they won because they had been taught the rules while others had only been beaten by them. When Elias had a spare coin, he did not spend it on sweets or games like other boys. He bought scraps, a torn ledger page, an old arithmetic primer, a sermon pamphlet, a water-damaged volume missing its cover. Anything with words. He taught himself in pieces, by candle stubs, by kitchen ash light, by memory when there was nothing to read and no light left to read it by. He copied letters with charcoal on broken boards. He memorized numbers while carrying papers through the rain. He sounded out legal phrases he barely understood and kept going anyway. It was not romantic work. Sometimes he was too hungry to focus. Sometimes he fell asleep sitting upright. Sometimes older boys stole the few books he had managed to gather. Once, after a week of hard rain, he lost nearly all his papers in the mud and was beaten by the distributor for the missing money. He got up the next morning and went back, because by then something hard and dangerous had started growing in him. Not bitterness, ambition. Not the soft kind that dreams, the brutal kind that studies. One winter morning, with sleet cutting through the streets and his fingers too numb to feel the papers beneath them, Elias saw 3 alley boys circling a stalled carriage at a crossing. Inside that small moment sat the choice that would split his life in 2. The carriage wheel had sunk into a rut, tilting the whole vehicle slightly to one side. The driver was cursing. The passenger, an English businessman in a fine dark coat, had stepped down in irritation, one gloved hand gripping a leather case. The case drew attention at once. Elias noticed the 3 boys before the gentleman did. He knew them all by face. Street scavengers, quick-handed, half-starved, already learning to turn desperation into habit. One of them saw Elias watching and gave him a look that was almost friendly. Come help. It would have been easy. A grabbed case, a vanished alley, enough money inside to feed a family for weeks, maybe months. Enough to buy books, shoes, meat. Enough to silence conscience. The Englishman still did not understand what was about to happen. Elias stood there in the cold, papers under one arm, hunger clawing at his belly, and knew exactly how much honesty cost a poor person. Then he moved. He shouted toward the far side of the street as if someone else were coming, startling one boy into turning his head. He flung his bundle of unsold papers at another's feet. Sheets scattered into sleet and mud. In the confusion, Elias lunged toward the gentleman, seized his sleeve, and said under his breath, "Get back into the carriage now if you want to keep that case." The case drew attention at once. Elias noticed the 3 boys before the gentleman did. He knew them all by face. Street scavengers, quick-handed, half-starved, already learning to turn desperation into habit. One of them saw Elias watching and gave him a look that was almost friendly. Come help. It would have been easy. A grabbed case, a vanished alley, enough money inside to feed a family for weeks, maybe months. Enough to buy books, shoes, meat. Enough to silence conscience. The Englishman still did not understand what was about to happen. Elias stood there in the cold, papers under one arm, hunger clawing at his belly, and knew exactly how much honesty cost a poor person. Then he moved. He shouted toward the far side of the street as if someone else were coming, startling one boy into turning his head. He flung his bundle of unsold papers at another's feet, sheets scattered into sleet and mud. In the confusion, Elias lunged toward the gentleman, seized his sleeve, and said under his breath, "Get back into the carriage now if you want to keep that case." The man stared at him, stunned more by the tone than the warning. Then one of the boys rushed anyway. Elias snatched up the driver's dropped cane and drove it low into the boy's legs. The attack broke apart in curses and sliding boots. The driver hauled at the horses. The gentleman scrambled back inside, and within seconds, the carriage was gone. The alley boys rounded on Elias instead. He took the first blow in the shoulder. The second split his lip. By the time he ran, one side of his face was wet with blood, his papers ruined in the slush, and whatever slim profit that morning might have brought was gone. No one thanked him. By midday, Elias had begun to think the whole choice had been another expensive lesson in how morality rewarded the poor with bruises. Then a message came. A hotel servant in neat livery found him near the market and told him a gentleman wished to see him. Elias almost refused. Boys like him did not get summoned into fine places, for good reasons. Still, he went. The hotel seemed to belong to another species of life. Polished floors, warm brick hearths, brass fixtures bright as coins, carpets thick enough to swallow footsteps, men in tailored coats speaking softly over wine they did not have to earn hour by hour. The English businessman was waiting in a private dining room. His name, Elias learned, was Edmund Harrow, a hotel proprietor with commercial interests across the colonies. The leather case sat beside him on the table. "You are not the sort of boy who usually helps a stranger for free," Harrow said. "No, sir." "Then why did you?" Elias considered inventing a noble answer. But noble answers were luxuries for people who had never had to calculate every risk. "Because men who steal one case remain thieves," he said. "Men who understand where wealth is moving may one day do better than stealing from it." For a moment, Harrow said nothing. Then he laughed. Not cruelly, not dismissively, in surprise. Most men would have noticed only that a poor boy had helped them. Harrow noticed the structure beneath the act. Judgment, nerve, and a mind already reaching above its station. By week's end, Elias was offered work at one of Harrow's large hotels. Not as an apprentice, not as a clerk, certainly not as an equal. As a dining room servant. Low enough to be ordered, close enough to observe. Elias accepted at once. He thought the hardest part of his life had ended. He was wrong. The hotel paid wages, yes. It fed him more regularly than the streets had. It put a roof over his head some nights and gave him a view into the machinery of the wealthy. But it also worked men to the bone. He carried trays until his shoulders burned. He stood so long his knees shook in bed at night. He polished silver, scrubbed floors, fetched coal, cleaned spills, swallowed insult, moved quickly, apologized faster, and learned that exhaustion itself could become a kind of climate. There were older servants who hated him on sight because Harrow had noticed him. There were supervisors who believed hunger should make a boy grateful, not curious. There were guests who spoke to him as if he were furniture, and others who enjoyed humiliating staff simply because they could. Elias endured all of it, watched all of it, learned from all of it. And there, in the endless labor of a world built for other men's comfort, he first began to understand that institutions revealed themselves most clearly from below. That was also where he first began to truly know Clara. At the start, she was only another employee moving through the lower corridors of the hotel, quick-handed, tired-eyed, with sleeves always slightly rolled, and a look that suggested she had no patience for foolish men. She worked between laundry accounts and household stores, forever correcting errors left behind by people paid more than she was. Their first real exchange came near midnight. Elias had been on his feet for nearly 16 hours. He slipped into the rear passage with a stolen minute to breathe and found Clara sitting on an overturned crate, eating a piece of bread so stale it looked dangerous. She glanced up at him, took in the split skin at his knuckles, and said, "You look like the hotel has decided to chew and swallow you." "It has not swallowed me yet. Give it time." Despite himself, he smiled. She tore the bread in half and held one piece out. Elias hesitated. "If I take that," he said, "you will have less." "If you keep talking," she replied, "I may change my mind." That was all. No grand beginning, no thunderbolt. Only half a stale piece of bread in a service corridor, shared between two tired young people who had no idea they were standing at the start of the great love of their lives. After that, they began to notice one another. A look across the kitchen rush. A muttered complaint traded while hauling lemons. A 5-minute walk home when shifts ended at the same hour. Her dry amusement when he grew too proud. His quiet attention when she was too exhausted to hide it. Nothing in Elias's life came easily. Not even love. Especially not love. Because people like them did not have the luxury of falling cleanly into it. Affection had to survive wages, fatigue, insult, crowded quarters, and the daily indignity of being useful to a world that would never call them important. But somehow, it did. And over the years that followed, while his body hardened and his mind sharpened, Clara became the one place in his life where he did not have to pretend not to be tired. Elias had entered the hotel as a servant. He did not leave that condition quickly. For a long time, advancement meant nothing more dramatic than being shouted at by men with better collars and slightly higher wages. It meant surviving where others quit. It meant being trusted with uglier work because he did not fail at it. It meant learning the habits of guests who never remembered his name and the weaknesses of supervisors who believed fear was management. What changed his life was not a sudden stroke of luck. It was accumulation. He watched everything. He watched which suppliers arrived late and still charged full rate, which clerks rounded numbers upward when no one checked, which rooms remained empty for reasons no ledger recorded, which cooks stole, which porters drank, which guests tipped for silence, which ones paid for speed, which disputes could be soothed with food, which with apology, which only with the illusion of being treated as important. A hotel, Elias began to understand, was not merely a building with rooms. It was a machine, made of appetite, vanity, exhaustion, scheduling, theft, weather, money, ego, and fear. And most men running such machines were less intelligent than they looked. So Elias studied at night. After double shifts, when others collapsed, he sat under weak light with scraps of paper and copied figures from memory. He built imaginary ledgers, tested prices, measured waste, calculated occupancy, thought through carriage timing, staff rotation, laundry flow, and kitchen supply. Sometimes he fell asleep over numbers and woke with ink dried on his wrist. He made mistakes, too. He trusted the wrong supervisor once and was blamed for missing stock he had not stolen. He challenged a clerk too bluntly and nearly lost his position for insolence. He tried to improve an ordering system before he had rank enough to be heard, and spent a month assigned to punishing shifts for his trouble. But each humiliation taught him where power truly sat. Not in titles, in information, in timing, in knowing when to speak, when to endure, and when to let another man underestimate you long enough to hang himself. Years passed that way, not as montage, but as labor. Winter storms that trapped guests and broke routines. Summer outbreaks that emptied corridors and demanded harsher sanitation. Supply failures, staff desertions, violent drunks. Kitchen fires put out before dawn. Entire weeks where Elias seemed to do little except work, think, sleep, and begin again. Through all of it, Clara remained near. She moved from rougher housework into laundry tallies, then inventory support, then guest preparation, because she remembered details no one else did, and had a calmness that did not crack under pressure. Where other staff flattered up and kicked down, Clara did neither. She simply did the work properly, which in that place made her seem almost radical. They grew close in fragments. Sometimes it was nothing more than walking home in silence, because both were too tired to speak. Sometimes it was Clara rubbing warmth back into his fingers after a winter shift so cold he could barely bend them. Sometimes it was Elias quietly repairing a broken latch in her room, because management would never waste money fixing a servant's comfort. Once, after Elias had been publicly humiliated by a superior who feared his competence, Clara found him outside behind the coal shed, jaw clenched so tight it shook. "You ought to be angry," she said. "I am angry." "No," she answered, stepping closer. "You are wounded. Those are not the same thing." He gave a bitter laugh. "And which is worse?" "For men like you," she said, "wounded pride. It makes you reckless." "And what makes me tolerable?" She looked at him a long moment. "The fact that you keep getting up." It was the nearest either had come to confession. The actual confession came much later, and almost by accident. A rainstorm had flooded the lower streets. Half the staff were delayed. The kitchen was in chaos. Elias and Clara were both still working well after midnight when the pressure finally broke, and laughter, exhausted, helpless, absurd laughter, seized them over some ruined dessert trays and a guest's outrageous complaint about damp cuffs. They ended up in a service passage, breathless and leaning against the wall, trying not to be heard. Then quiet came down around them. Elias looked at her. Clara looked back. Neither of them were dressed for romance. Both were tired beyond elegance. There was flour on one sleeve of her dress and soot at his collar. "I think," Elias said, "that if I do not kiss you now, I will regret it for the rest of my life." Clara held his gaze for one suspended second. "Then do not be foolish enough to wait," she said. So he kissed her there, in a narrow corridor that smelled faintly of soap and steam and burnt sugar, with rain striking the far windows and half the hotel asleep above them. It was not grand. It was better than grand, because it was theirs. After that, love did not transform their lives into softness. They were still poor, still overworked, still subject to a world ruled by others. But now there was someone to walk toward at the end of each brutal day. Someone who understood the cost of ambition because she was paying for it beside him. And Elias did rise, but not all at once. First, he was trusted with stock control because he knew where wastage vanished. Then, late-night guest issues because he could solve conflict quickly. Then, staff coordination during busy seasons. Then, emergency oversight when a manager collapsed under the pressure of a storm week, and Harrow found, to his own surprise, that the young servant-turned-supervisor had already prevented 3 disasters before anyone had formally put him in charge. Each step upward brought resentment. A poor boy could be useful. A poor boy with a mind was troublesome. A poor boy who could run systems better than men born into authority was something else entirely. So the blows changed shape. They were no longer fists in alleys. They became whispers, deliberate omissions, petty sabotage, smiles with contempt hidden behind them. Elias learned to outlast those too. By the time Harrow finally named him manager of one of the company's most demanding properties, the title did not feel like a miracle. It felt expensive. It had cost him sleep, blood, youth, softness, illusions, and years of effort no one would ever record in full. That night, long after the announcement, he found Clara alone in a back courtyard, hanging washed cloth to dry in the night air. "They finally gave you what you have been doing for years," she said. There was pride in her voice, but also something gentler. Elias stood there in the half-dark, looking at her, and knew with sudden certainty that no triumph in his life had ever felt complete until she knew of it. "I could not have done it without you," he said. Clara gave him a look halfway between affection and reproach. "Do not say pretty things to me just because you have a title now." "It is inconvenient," he stepping closer, "that I said them before the title, too." She smiled then, that quiet, rare smile he trusted more than applause, and touched his face with work-worn fingers. "Good," she said, "because I loved you before either of us had anything worth boasting about." He bent and kissed her beneath the lines of drying cloth, with the night wind moving around them and the whole grand hotel looming behind like a beast they had survived another day inside. And though neither of them could yet see how far Elias would climb, both of them understood one truth already. Nothing about that future would be given. It would be taken, inch by inch, hour by hour, year by year, by a man too stubborn to stay small, and by the woman who had chosen, long before the world noticed him, to stay. Scene 5. The first hotel, the years of expansion, and the first shadows moving. By the time Elias Whitford became manager, he was no longer poor in the exact way he had once been. He ate regularly. He had decent coats. He slept indoors without fear of rain finding its way through the roof. Men who had once spoken over him now sometimes waited for his judgment before making a decision. But he was not free. That distinction mattered. A salary, even a respectable one, was still a tether. Rank inside another man's institution was still dependence polished into a better shape. Elias had climbed far enough to understand the machinery of profit. but not far enough to own any of it. He could improve a hotel. He could rescue a failing quarter. He could increase revenue, reduce waste, refine service, and make rich men richer by doing what they had never bothered to learn how to do themselves. Yet at the end of it, the empire remained someone else's. That truth began to sit in him like a stone. At first, he tried to ignore it. There was work enough to keep any ambitious man occupied. Harrow trusted him with more. Other properties sent for his opinion. Clerks who had once dismissed him now copied his methods when they thought he would not notice. Guests asked after him by name. Suppliers became more careful around him. Elias might have spent the rest of his life becoming indispensable inside another man's world and called it success. But the idea of that began to feel like a cage with velvet draped over the bars. It was Clara, as usual, who saw the unrest before he spoke it. They were walking home late one evening through a street silvered by recent rain. Elias had been unusually quiet all night, his thoughts moving behind his face with a force she knew too well. "You are angry again," she said. "I am thinking." "That is usually when you are most dangerous." He gave a faint smile, but it did not last. After a moment he said, "Have you ever noticed how often men praise hard work when what they truly mean is obedience?" Clara glanced sideways at him. "That is too sharp a sentence to be accidental. How long have you been carrying it?" "Long enough." She said nothing, so he continued. "I know how to run these places better than half the men who own them, better than some who inherited them, better than some who sit at tables discussing expansion while their businesses bleed from leaks they are too proud to see." His voice stayed low, but there was something hot beneath it now. "And still, the highest reward available to me is to become useful enough that another man fears losing me." Clara let him finish. Then, softly, "That sounds like a man who is no longer meant to remain where he is." Elias looked at her. The rain-slick street, the dim lamps, the hard years behind them, all of it seemed to gather in that one glance. "It would be ruinous," he said. "It might. We have savings, but not enough, not for what I would want to build." "I know. I would lose security." "You have never worshipped security." He exhaled through his nose, almost a laugh, almost surrender. "And if I fail?" Clara's answer came without drama. "Then you fail," she said. "And if there is one thing I know about you, Elias Whitford, it is that you are not built to stay down where you fall." That was the beginning. Not a dramatic resignation, not one brave leap made in a single afternoon. The beginning was quieter than that. A private ledger started beneath their bed. Coins sorted into categories. Expenses cut until they felt almost like the old days. Elias studying locations, traffic routes, harbor schedules, carriage patterns, seasonal demand, supply costs, staffing models. Clara checking the figures, questioning assumptions, catching errors when exhaustion made him careless. They talked at night until the candles guttered. What kind of travelers were most neglected? Which roads were underserved? Why did established hotels waste so much on display while failing at reliability? Why must every respectable inn force guests of different means into either insult or excess? Why did the wealthy forgive disorder so long as they were flattered, and ordinary travelers endure humiliation simply because no one had yet bothered to build something better. Elias did not dream of opening the grandest hotel in the colonies. He dreamed of opening the most intelligently run one. That difference would make him rich. It would also make him enemies. When he finally left Harrow's employ to establish his own house, not everyone thought him bold. Many thought him ungrateful. Some thought him insane. A few, more perceptive than the rest, watched in silence because they sensed a more dangerous truth. A man who understood systems from the floorboards up was more threatening than one born into command. The first property he acquired was not impressive. It stood near a busy route, but on a lot other investors had dismissed as inconvenient. The building itself had potential and problems in equal measure. Rooms too unevenly sized, kitchens poorly ventilated, a yard arrangement that slowed carriage turnover, drains that backed up in heavy rain, staff quarters unfit even by the low standards usually afforded to workers. The asking price was low, because most men with money preferred prettier failures to ugly opportunities. Elias bought the ugly opportunity. Then came the real cost. Renovation devoured capital faster than he had projected. Lumber prices shifted. One contractor vanished after taking an advance. A shipment of decent linen arrived mildew-stained. The cook he had hoped to hire was poached by a competitor before opening week. A city inspector delayed a permit for reasons that were never stated plainly and only resolved after time, humiliation, and a fee no honest schedule had listed. There were weeks when Elias did not sleep more than 3 hours at a stretch. He negotiated before dawn, lifted furniture by noon, checked invoices by candlelight, and still found new leaks in the roof and budget alike. There were nights he stared at the books until the numbers blurred, and understood, with a chill he did not show Clara, how narrow the gap was between daring and disaster. Once, halfway through the work, he said quietly, "If this collapses, it will take everything." Clara, seated opposite him with her sleeves rolled and ink on 2 fingers, did not look up from the ledger. "Then it is fortunate," she said, "that we did not come this far in order to frighten easily." He laughed despite himself. It was either laugh or let dread swallow him whole. She looked up then, softer. "You are allowed to be afraid, Elias." "I know. But do not start mistaking fear for prophecy." That, too, was love. Not soothing him with false confidence. Not pretending the stakes were smaller than they were. Simply standing beside the truth without flinching. When the hotel finally opened, success did not come with trumpets. The first weeks were uneven. Some rooms sat empty. One wealthy guest declared the place efficient in a rather common way, intending insult and giving prophecy instead. A rival owner spread whispers that Whitford's establishment cut corners because it charged less extravagantly than houses built for vanity. Staff training took longer than Elias wanted because he refused to hire entirely on polish and preferred steadiness to pedigree. A few early travelers praised the service, yet did not return quickly enough to ease the anxiety in his books. Then the tide began to turn. A shipping merchant stayed once and came back with partners because his room had been ready on time. his trunks handled properly, his private papers undisturbed, and his departure arranged without confusion. A widow traveling with children told 3 families that Whitford's house was the first place in years where she had not been made to feel like a burden because she lacked a male escort. 2 army officers, accustomed to pomp and delay elsewhere, discovered they preferred fast meals, clean bedding, and staff who remembered what was asked the first time. A merchant captain recommended the place to every reliable man on his route, because the kitchen opened before dawn if departures demanded it. Reliability spread by word of mouth. Then reputation spread faster. Elias had understood something older establishments had forgotten. Grandeur impressed a guest once, but trust brought him back. So he built for return. Rooms were standardized where possible, so expectations did not fluctuate wildly between wings. Inventory was counted with a rigor others considered obsessive until it began protecting margins. Kitchens tracked waste. Stable operations were timed. Staff were trained to observe without intruding, to solve without dramatizing, to remember preferences without servility curdling into spectacle. Travelers of modest means were treated with order rather than contempt. Wealthier guests discovered to their own surprise that privacy and efficiency pleased them more deeply than ornamental nonsense. The house began to prosper, not all at once, not cleanly, but undeniably. Years tightened and expanded around the business. 1 hotel became 2. The second was harder, because expansion always is. The third nearly broke him because a trusted hire proved weak in the wrong moment. The fourth only succeeded because Elias had learned by then how growth itself could become a form of waste if discipline failed to keep pace. He saved where others displayed, reinvested where others celebrated, watched debt like a predator, never forgot how quickly a man could lose what took him years to build. Clara was no ornament to these years. She did not stand beside his empire smiling vaguely while he created it. She worked. She knew staff character better than many managers did. She caught small dishonesty before it widened into rot. She understood guest temperament, household strain, the hidden friction between appearance and operation. When Elias pushed too hard in one direction, she often saw the human cost before the ledgers did. When he was exhausted enough to become ruthless with himself, she reminded him that systems broke not only through waste, but through overstrain. More than once, one of his properties held because Clara had noticed what he, in ambition or fatigue, had missed. Their life together grew in the seams of labor. Suppers eaten too late. Brief rides between properties. Shared laughter over absurd complaints from men who considered themselves kings because they owned cuffs with better stitching. Kisses stolen in offices after midnight. Arguments over risk that ended not in distance, but in deeper trust, because each had earned the right to challenge the other. Once, after the opening of his third property, Elias found Clara standing alone in an unfinished upper corridor at dusk, looking out over the street below. "You are doing it," she said without turning. "The impossible, little by little." He came to stand beside her. "It does not feel impossible while I am doing it," he said. "It feels expensive." Clara smiled faintly. "Those are often the same thing." He looked at her then, not as the tired girl with bread in a service corridor years ago, nor only as the woman whose judgment he trusted more than anyone's, but as the person without whom his life, however successful, would have felt badly built. "When this is steady," he said quietly, "when the next year is steadier than the last, when I can give you more than promises and unfinished plans." She turned to face him fully. "Elias." He stopped. There was affection in her eyes, and amusement, and a weariness that matched his own because she had climbed beside him all this way. "You still speak," she said, "as if I am waiting for your life to become worthy of joining." He stared at her. Then, with that same dry softness she had always reserved for him, she added, "I joined it years ago." He laughed then, but his eyes burned. He drew her to him and held her in the dim corridor while the evening gathered outside and workmen shouted faintly below. The kiss they shared was slow, familiar, and far more intimate than the first startled one in the service passage had been. Not because it held more desire, because now it held history. By the time Whitford properties had spread across multiple colonial cities, Elias's name no longer traveled only among clerks and innkeepers. Merchants spoke it. Shipping men watched it. Investors measured against it. Officials, even those who would never publicly admire a man from his origins, began to account for it. And with visibility came resistance. At first it wore the face of ordinary competition. A supplier learning private details too quickly. A lease negotiation undercut in suspiciously precise ways. A city official suddenly interested in inspections no one else endured. Rumors blooming in one port just before Elias entered another. A sealed document arriving already tampered with so subtly another man might have missed it. Elias did not yet call these things coordinated, but he noticed them. He noticed, too, that certain merchant circles, old families, protected interests, men whose fortunes seemed mysteriously insulated from the chaos battering others, had begun speaking of him with a courtesy that felt less like acceptance than measurement. He refused lucrative arrangements that would have tied his routes and supply lines to houses he did not trust. He declined partnerships offered in tones too smooth to be clean. He asked unwelcome questions about customs discrepancies, warehouse transfers, and changes of ownership recorded on paper more neatly than in practice. He began to observe that some failing properties did not truly fail. They were hollowed, shifted, renamed, and absorbed through means respectable enough to pass in public and rotten enough to stink beneath scrutiny. The more he built, the more clearly he saw that commerce in the colonies was not merely trade. It was a web. And somewhere inside that web, hands far older and better protected than his own were already beginning to feel the strain of a man they had once considered too low-born to matter. That was when the first true shadow crossed his path. Not a villain stepping into lamplight, not a revealed enemy, nothing so simple. Only a new employee placed where he need not have been. A transfer recommended by someone with polished credentials and forgettable eyes. Too competent in the wrong ways. Too smooth in deference. Too careful to seem harmless. Elias noted him, then looked away. He had too much to run, too much to build, too much to protect. But the board had already been set, and though he could not yet see the face of the men who would one day order his death, their attention had begun to settle on him long before he understood how much of his life had already entered their sights. For a long while, Lord Cedric Ashbourne did not think Elias Whitford needed to be destroyed. Managed, perhaps. Contained, certainly. brought into proper alignment if he proved intelligent enough to understand what was being offered. But not destroyed. Not yet. To Cedric, Elias was at first no more than an irritation with uncommon stamina, a self-made hotel man who had risen too high, too quickly, and with too little reverence for the old arrangements that kept wealth where it belonged. He was useful proof that talent could occasionally be permitted to rise, so long as it learned, in time, whom it was expected to serve. That was Cedric's instinctive view of men like him. Not equals, not true rivals, only vigorous outsiders who mistook motion for a rival. So Cedric did what men of his class had always done when confronted with unusual ability in the wrong hands. He tested whether it could be purchased before deciding whether it must be broken. The invitations came first. Private suppers, quiet gaming rooms, conversations in polished houses where every courtesy concealed a valuation. Cedric never insulted Elias openly. That would have been crude. Worse, it would have been imprecise. Men like Cedric preferred to flatter in ways that reminded the recipient how conditional the flattery was. "You have done remarkably well," he told Elias at one such gathering. "There is a discipline in your expansion that many older houses might study with profit." "Then I am pleased to have contributed to their education," Elias replied. Cedric smiled faintly. "I hope, in time, you will contribute more than that." There were always men nearby when conversations like these happened. Merchant houses with old money, legal intermediaries, investors who understood power better than morality. They listened without seeming to listen, measuring whether Whitford would eventually bend toward the same conclusion every ambitious outsider was expected to reach. Grow if you must. Prosper if you can. But prosper inside the structure already built by better-born hands. Cedric's offers were never spoken in vulgar terms. He used words like stability, coordination, mutual benefit. He spoke of established channels, of unnecessary friction, of the dangers facing any man who rose too quickly without anchoring himself to interests older and stronger than his own. Behind each version of the invitation lay the same demand: stop growing like an independent force. Accept the leash and call it partnership. Elias refused each time. Not dramatically, not with enough pride to be called insolence in public. He refused with something far more dangerous: clarity. He declined supply arrangements that would have tied his roots to Cedric-aligned houses. He rejected protective investment. He resisted pressure to root expansion through favored intermediaries. He listened politely, answered carefully, and yielded nothing essential. At first, Cedric found this more vexing than alarming. A man like Whitford could still be taught, he thought. Some men needed to feel the cost of independence before they learned to dress obedience in the name of prudence. So the pressure changed. Permits slowed. Suppliers withdrew. Inspections appeared in one city just before openings in another. Bids were undercut with uncanny precision. Cedric still did not view this as war. It was discipline, a demonstration, a reminder that there were old hands on the wheel and that men of Elias's origin survived longest when they remembered that fact. Then Elias did something more dangerous than refusing. He began noticing. At first, what he noticed seemed like the ordinary dirt of commerce. strange debt structures, ownership transfers too neat to be clean, records that contradicted themselves only if one read them closely enough. But Cedric's world depended on an old arrogance, the belief that men like Elias, however sharp, would remain too busy building, too grateful for assent, or too cautious in class to follow corruption where it truly led. Cedric underestimated two things. The first was Elias's memory. The second was Elias's appetite for understanding systems from the inside. Once Elias began pulling at the loose threads, the pattern started showing itself. Properties changed hands through names that masked the same beneficiaries. Tax burdens vanished in one ledger only to reappear in altered form elsewhere. Merchant houses that competed in public behaved in private like limbs of the same body. Clerks with different masters wrote with suspiciously similar instincts. It was not random dishonesty. It was design. And though Elias did not yet possess the full map, he had begun walking straight toward its center. That was when Cedric's view of him shifted for the first time. Not because Whitford had become richer. Rich men could still be bargained with. Not because Whitford had become admired. Admiration was fickle and therefore easy to manage. But because Whitford had become curious in the wrong direction. A man who wants status can be fed. A man who wants profit can be bought. A man who wants truth is something else. Cedric understood that at once. So he tried once more to turn Elias aside, this time without the softness of flattery. At a smaller dinner, with fewer witnesses and more danger in the air, Cedric said, "Trade in the colonies survives by accommodations no sermon would bless if forced to hear them spoken plainly. A practical man learns which structures are too old and too useful to disturb." Elias answered without hesitation, "If a structure depends on fraud to survive, my lord, then what it protects is not order, only theft with better manners." Cedric held his gaze. There it was. Not merely defiance, judgment. Worse, moral judgment from a man Cedric still believed should have been grateful simply to sit at such a table. That alone would have been enough to harden his dislike. The first time Elias truly crossed paths with Nathaniel Ashcroft, it was not in a drawing room, but over a property dispute another man had expected to settle quietly. A warehouse parcel near the river had been shifted through 3 names in under a year, burdened with contradictory debt, and attached to filings that made sense only if one assumed everyone reading them would either be lazy or corrupt. Elias had traced the irregularities because one of his supply routes kept getting obstructed by claims that changed shape each time he challenged them. Ashcroft had arrived because the final petition had reached offices too respectable to ignore. They did not know one another then. Ashcroft expected another aggrieved tradesman with ambition too hot in his blood. Elias expected another well-born gentleman prepared to be impressed by paperwork so long as it had the proper seal. Both men were disappointed, which was the beginning. Elias laid out the chain of contradictions from memory before anyone else in the room had fully grasped the files in their own hands. Ashcroft asked 3 questions sharp enough to expose whether he was merely guessing. He was not. Ashcroft left that meeting understanding that Whitford possessed more than commercial instinct. He possessed discipline, recall, and a dangerous refusal to look away once falsehood revealed its shape. Elias left it understanding something equally important. Nathaniel Ashcroft was not one more polished guardian of a rotten system. He was one of the rare men inside it who still believed law had meaning when it became inconvenient. They did not become friends at once. Respect came first. Then a second encounter. then a third. A filing contradiction Ashcroft quietly ensured reached the right desk. A customs discrepancy Elias had already half-mapped before Ashcroft's clerks arrived. A conversation after midnight over papers no one else had read carefully enough. Each time, they tested one another. Ashcroft wanted to know whether Whitford's outrage was vanity dressed as principle. Elias wanted to know whether Ashcroft's integrity would survive contact with names powerful enough to stain a man merely by being examined. In time, both got their answer. Ashcroft found a self-made man who could not be bought into silence. Elias found a well-placed one who could not be bullied out of decency. They never became sentimental. Men like them did not. But a working trust formed, and then something firmer beneath it. Not patronage, not dependency. Recognition. Cedric had tolerated Whitford as a troublesome commercial force. He had even tolerated his stubbornness, though narrowly. What he could not tolerate was the possibility that Whitford might become legible to a man like Ashcroft. Nathaniel Ashcroft was not easy to buy, not easy to shame, and not easy to isolate. His standing was too real for that. He represented something Cedric despised, not because it was weak, but because it was strong in a way privilege could not wholly command. Legitimacy with spine. When Cedric began noticing Whitford's name appearing in matters Ashcroft touched, property disputes, filing contradictions, commercial irregularities, the irritation deepened into something colder. He still did not panic. That was not his nature. He assessed. Whitford was economically strong enough to resist absorption. Whitford was intelligent enough to follow paper further than most men dared. Whitford was morally stubborn enough not to look away once he understood what he was seeing. And now, Whitford was no longer fully alone. That final point mattered most. Cedric did not believe Ashcroft had made Whitford. He was too accurate a reader of class for that. Whitford's success had clearly been self-won. But that made the danger worse, not better. A self-made man with proof was already difficult. A self-made man with proof who might be heard by Ashcroft was intolerable. Even then, Cedric delayed. He wanted certainty. He watched Whitford more closely. He let pressure gather. He allowed his people to measure roots, habits, conversations, vulnerabilities. And through the leak he had already placed inside Whitford's world, information reached him with increasing regularity. Private timing, operational movement, social plans, personal intentions. Then came the final piece. Whitford intended to propose to Clara. That news, when it reached Cedric, did not matter because of romance. Cedric was not sentimental enough to care about the sacredness of such moments. It mattered because he immediately understood the shape of the opportunity. A private setting, a lowered guard, a man with his future in his hand instead of his suspicions. And beneath that tactical opportunity lay the larger conclusion Cedric had finally reached. Whitford would never be folded in, never bought, never taught to accept his station, never persuaded that corruption was simply the price of realism. He had crossed the line from inconvenience into threat, not because he was loud, because he was relentless, not because he was reckless, because he was disciplined, not because he stood outside the structure, because he had begun to understand it. That was what made Cedric decide. Not anger alone, not class hatred alone. Fear, sharpened by intelligence. Whitford knew too much. Whitford would not stop. Whitford might yet place truth where it could no longer be buried quietly. So Cedric did what frightened powerful men have always done when they cannot own the future. He tried to kill it before it arrived. And he chose the night Elias meant to ask Clara to marry him because no form of power feels more complete to a man like Cedric than the power to strike at happiness itself. Death did not come for Elias Whitford cleanly. It came in waves. Pain. Darkness. The taste of blood. The memory of Clara saying yes. Then the sound of gunfire again. Even half-conscious, he knew what those extra shots meant. No, not her. Then there were new voices, a struggle, a curse. Someone shouting for a surgeon. Someone else saying, "He is still alive." When Elias next surfaced, it was to agony. He was in a room he did not recognize. The air smelled of spirits, metal, and medicine. Every breath felt like punishment. Lord Nathaniel Ashcroft rose from a chair near the fire. "You are not dead," he said. Elias tried to speak. Pain tore through his ribs. The physician at his side muttered, "The bullet passed where it should have killed you, except that in your case Providence seems to have misplaced the heart." His heart, as it turned out, lay to the right instead of the left. A strange, private misplacement of flesh had become the thin wall between him and the grave. Another inch, another ordinary body, and he would have died in the garden beside Clara. The knowledge did not feel like triumph. Then memory returned whole. The lanterns, the ring, Clara's face, the shots. Ashcroft saw the question before Elias could force it into words. "She did not survive," he said. No sentence had ever struck Elias harder. For several days afterward, Elias drifted through fever and pain while Ashcroft kept him hidden in a secure house outside the city. Officially, the world believed Elias Whitford was dead. That lie saved him. Ashcroft explained the broad outlines once Elias could sit upright. "The men who did this believed the matter settled," he said. "That is your only advantage at present." "How did you know?" Elias asked. "I had reason to think your movements were being watched more closely than mere commercial rivalry justified. By the time my men found the garden, the attack had already begun." "And Clara?" "She was beyond saving." Ashcroft let the silence stand, then said, "If you mean to blame yourself first, at least be disciplined enough not to stop there. The guilt belongs elsewhere." At last Elias said the name. "Cedric." Ashcroft did not ask how certain he was. "Cedric Ashbourne stands near the center," Elias said. "Not alone, never alone, but near enough that if he falls properly, others will break with him." "And can you prove it?" "Not yet." "Then Elias Whitford remains dead," Ashcroft said, "for a little while longer." The idea landed hard. Dead. Not in truth, in strategy. Ashcroft handled the rest with brutal efficiency. Clara was buried under guard. A ruined body from the scene, damaged enough by shot and confusion to resist close scrutiny, was put forward under Whitford's name. The papers were sealed, the physician bound to silence, and society was given exactly what it most readily accepts: a tidy death
and no reason to question it. To complete the lie, one of Elias's former employees was produced within days and confessed to killing both Elias and Clara out of private resentment. He claimed dismissal, grievance, and wounded pride had driven him to murder. It was ugly, personal, and plausible enough that most of the city stopped asking harder questions. "They will move against your holdings," Ashcroft said. "They will manufacture legitimacy. They will begin taking what they believe has been left unguarded. Men who commit murder in the name of order nearly always rush to clothe theft in procedure afterward. That is when we watch." Elias closed his hand around Clara's ring once it was returned to him from the garden. Then he said, "I will go after them as the man they failed to bury."
The first thing Cedric Ashbourne stole was not property. It was narrative. Before touching the Whitford holdings, he made sure society would be ready to misunderstand what followed. So the whispers began. Not accusations, but careful concerns. That Whitford had expanded too quickly. That some of his books were perhaps less sound than people believed. That sudden death often revealed weaknesses success had hidden. That responsible men might soon need to step in. The language was elegant. Its purpose was carrion. From hiding, Elias received reports through Ashcroft's channels, copied notices, private remarks, legal hints disguised as routine procedure. Cedric was softening reputation before seizing property. Then came the second theft. Time. Old debts were rediscovered. Licensing reviews reopened. Questions rose over customs records and ownership chains. Together, they formed a siege. Cedric was not trying to seize Whitford's empire in one motion. He was isolating, weakening, reframing, making the eventual takeover appear less like predation than rescue. Somewhere inside that attack, another truth hardened. The leak was still active. Too many responses were being anticipated. Too many papers moved, and within days, the wrong people behaved as though they already knew what was inside them. So Elias built another ledger, not of money, of betrayal. He listed names, access points, movements, motives. One name surfaced too often to ignore. Percival Dorn. Dorn had always seemed built to be overlooked. Competent, polite, forgettable. Once Elias revisited old incidents with fresh eyes, the pattern formed quickly. A recommendation tied indirectly to Cedric's circles. A memorandum that should never have reached Dorn's desk. A suspiciously timed travel request before one private meeting was compromised. A planted rumor that drifted almost perfectly into Cedric's orbit. "It is him," Elias said at last. Ashcroft reviewed the final chain and nodded. "Yes." Elias sat with that a long moment. Then, quietly, "Clara knew." "She told me there was something wrong with him," Elias said. "I remembered it. I did not act on it." Ashcroft offered no comfort. "Then act on it now." So they did. False scheduling notes were planted. Harmless property rumors were allowed to travel. Courier routes were shifted experimentally. Each time, the leaks bent back toward Cedric's orbit. By then, Elias could see what came next. Cedric would not be content with harassment forever. He had tasted success. He believed Whitford dead. He would want a public moment, a formal act large enough to bless the theft. A merger, Elias said one night. Not called theft, called preservation. Ashcroft inclined his head. Yes. That was when the strategy changed. They would not stop Cedric too early. They would let him build the full structure. Let him gather the forged papers. Let Dorn continue believing himself unseen. Let the merchant houses step far enough into the light that retreat became impossible. Then they would break him in the act. From then on, everything narrowed toward one day. One evening, after a courier left with fresh copies of the evidence, Elias stood by the window while Ashcroft joined him. "You are thinking of the day itself," Ashcroft said. "Yes." "And what do you want from it?" Elias did not answer at once. Then he said, "Not simply to prove I survived." Ashcroft waited. "I want Cedric to understand, in front of every man who helped him, that the dead watched them while they fed." Ashcroft gave a slight nod. "Good," he said. "Hatred is only useful when disciplined into timing." By the time winter loosened its grip, Cedric Ashbourne was ready to convert murder into law. He did not call it theft. He called it consolidation, a necessary intervention, a responsible transfer of vulnerable holdings after the tragic death of Elias Whitford. Publicly, the tone was respectful. Privately, the machinery was already in motion. The event would take place in Philadelphia. A private commercial hall had been chosen, respectable enough to bless greed, discreet enough to control the room. There, before merchants, legal intermediaries, and selected witnesses, Cedric intended to formalize the absorption of Whitford's holdings into steadier hands. He meant to do more than seize Elias's empire. He meant to rewrite its history. One evening, Ashcroft placed the final packet on the table.
"It is set," he said.
Elias looked down at the date in silence. Months ago, he had meant to stand before Clara and ask for a future. Now another day had been fixed before him. Not for union, for reckoning. "What names?" he asked. "Cedric. 2 principal merchant houses, 3 legal intermediaries, 1 customs official, several investors. Enough witnesses to establish legitimacy." "Dorn?" "Yes." Good. That was exactly what Elias needed. The last days before Philadelphia were spent not in rage, but in order. The evidence was arranged in layers. The first would shock. The second would prove. The third would widen the damage beyond Cedric alone. Travel to Philadelphia was arranged in secrecy. On the day itself, Ashcroft secured Elias in a private upper room of a building adjacent to the hall. From the window above, Elias watched the arrivals. Carriages, assistants with leather cases, legal clerks, merchant representatives, a customs official, broad in waist and narrow in courage. Then Percival Dorn, neatly dressed, calm, respectable, and at last Cedric Ashbourne. Even at a distance, Cedric looked exactly as he always had, composed, precise, perfectly certain the world had arranged itself properly for him. For one brutal instant, Elias imagined ending everything with a pistol before Cedric ever reached the hall. The thought passed. Too small. Cedric deserved to watch his own structure collapse in public. Ashcroft entered the room a few moments later. "You are angry enough," he said, reading Elias at once, "to be useful." "The order?" Elias asked. "I go in first once Cedric begins formal remarks and the transfer instruments are in view. You enter on my signal, not before." Everything after that became exact. The hour approached. Voices gathered below. Packets changed hands. A bell marked the beginning of proceedings. A knock came at the door. One of Ashcroft's men. "Now," he said. Elias rose, adjusted his coat once, closed his hand briefly around Clara's ring, and let it go. When he stepped into the corridor, he did not feel resurrected. Resurrection implied mercy. This was return. Cedric Ashbourne was already speaking when the doors opened. He stood at the front of the hall beside the long table where the transfer papers lay arranged beneath seals, signatures, and the calm architecture of respectable theft. The room had settled into the solemn mood he wanted. Measured grief, polite concern, the false dignity that allows powerful men to steal while sounding burdened by duty. "And so," Cedric was saying, "in the wake of Mr. Whitford's tragic death, it falls to steadier hands to preserve what instability now threatens." The doors swung wider. Every head turned. And Elias Whitford walked in alive. The effect was not surprise. It was rupture. One clerk gasped aloud. A merchant half rose before remembering himself. Someone near the back dropped a folio hard enough for the crack to echo through the room. The careful atmosphere Cedric had spent weeks constructing shattered in a single heartbeat. Cedric stopped speaking. That alone was worth the moment. For the first time in that entire assembly, the room belonged to someone else. Elias did not pause at the threshold. He kept walking, slowly, visibly, with the full weight of his survival carried in every step. No haste, no uncertainty. Let them look. Let them count the impossible distance between the grave they had accepted and the living man now crossing the floor toward them. Ashcroft was already rising, but Elias reached the center of the hall before Cedric could recover his voice, and when he spoke, he did not begin with irony. He began like a man issuing judgment. "No one in this room will sign another paper," he said. His voice carried cleanly across the chamber. "These proceedings are built on forgery, theft, conspiracy, and blood." Now there was real movement. Chairs scraping, men turning, some toward the papers, some toward the doors, some instinctively toward Cedric, as if waiting for him to restore reality by sheer force of composure. Cedric found his voice. "Mr. Whitford," he said, each word controlled with visible effort, "whatever confusion has arisen from your condition, this is hardly confusion," Elias cut across him. That hit harder because he did not shout. He looked directly at Cedric. "There is no confusion here. You believed I was dead. You believed the woman I loved was dead. And you believed that gave you the right to bury my life's work under forged instruments and call it order." A shockwave of silence passed through the room. No one could pretend not to understand him now. This was no longer subtext, no longer implication, no longer a gentleman's dispute dressed in careful language. It was accusation, plain and public. Cedric tried to seize the frame back. "These are the words of a man fresh from violence and grief," he said. "I think everyone here can recognize the difference between trauma and evidence." Ashcroft stepped forward then. "Evidence," he said, "is precisely why I am here." He signaled once. His men moved at once, not dramatically, but fast enough that the room felt the trap closing. Packet after packet was placed on the table. Ashcroft spoke over the rising unrest. Forged transfer chains linked across Philadelphia and Newport. Debt instruments contradicted by prior filings. Ownership records altered through shell entities. Correspondence tying restricted Whitford information to outside intermediaries before legal challenge began. Statements already secured from clerks and registrars. This assembly is no longer a commercial proceeding. It is now a matter of criminal inquiry. The room erupted. Too many voices at once, denials, outrage, frantic distinctions. One merchant protested he had attended only as witness. Another insisted his firm had relied entirely on representations made in good faith. A customs man near the end of the table looked as though he wished to dissolve into the woodwork. Elias did not look at any of them. He looked only at Cedric. Then he spoke again, this time more directly than before. "You did not come here to preserve anything," he said. "You came here to steal what you could not build." Cedric's jaw tightened. Elias stepped closer. "You pressured my roots. You tampered with filings. You used shell holdings and false debt to weaken my houses. You placed a man inside my world to feed you schedules, documents, and private movement. And when that was no longer enough, when you understood I was learning too much and would not kneel to you, you sent gunmen into a garden." At that, the room changed. Even the men who had been trying to calculate distance from the fraud now went still for another reason. Murder had entered the hall by name. Cedric answered instantly. "This is outrageous!" "No," Elias said. "This is public." That landed hard. He did not let Cedric recover. "You hid behind law while arranging theft. You hid behind class while arranging fraud. You hid behind order while arranging murder. And today you meant to complete it, to make every man in this room a witness not to justice, but to the burial of truth." Cedric's control thinned, only slightly. "Enough." "You overestimate your importance," Cedric said. "You always did. Men like you survive one fortunate ascent and begin imagining the world turns because you discovered effort." Elias answered without hesitation. "No, men like you inherit a corrupt world and begin imagining it was built by right." That struck deeper than the room understood. Cedric's face changed, not much, but enough for those closest to see that this was no longer a public inconvenience. Elias had reached the nerve beneath the manners. Ashcroft cut in before Cedric could turn rhetoric into delay. "Lord Cedric Ashbourne," he said, formal now, implacable. "You and all persons materially implicated in these instruments are to be detained pending further examination. These papers are impounded. This room is under order. No one leaves until identity, role, and relation to the filings have been taken in full." For 1 second, no one moved. Then the room broke. Real panic this time. Not social alarm, Not offended dignity. Fear. A clerk tried to slip toward the side door and was stopped. One of Cedric's legal intermediaries began speaking too quickly to sound innocent. A merchant snapped that this detention was intolerable, to which Ashcroft replied that truth often was. And Cedric did the one thing he had not done since Elias entered. He raised his voice. "You cannot hold this room on the strength of spectacle and resentment." Ashcroft did not even turn fully toward him. "I am holding it," he said, "on the strength of evidence." Then Elias delivered the final blow. Not to the law, to the room. He turned, not to Cedric, but to all those gathered there. "Look carefully," he said. "Every man here was invited to lend respectability to theft. Some of you knew it. Some of you suspected it. Some of you told yourselves it was only trade, only procedure, only unfortunate necessity after a death already settled. But my death was the instrument. Her death was the price. And the signatures you were about to place on those papers would have made you partners in both." No one spoke, because he was right, and they knew it. The hall had begun as Cedric's ceremony. Now it was an indictment. Cedric stood at the center of the ruin he had arranged, and for the first time since Elias had known him, the old ease was gone from him completely. Not dignity, not posture. Ease. Good. Let him feel that. Ashcroft's men moved through the room, collecting packets, sealing documents, taking names. One by one, the instruments of Cedric's triumph vanished from the table and changed shape in public view. No longer transfer papers. Evidence. Elias stood in the center of it all and did not look away. He had not returned to haunt them. He had returned to name them. And by the time the first of Cedric's circle were placed under formal detention for further inquiry, everyone in that hall understood the same thing. The dead man had not merely walked back into the room. He had dragged the truth in behind him. The room did not calm after the papers were seized. It fractured. Merchants protested. Clerks spoke too quickly. Legal men who had arrived to bless Cedric's victory now fought to separate themselves from it. Everyone wanted the same thing in different words. Distance. Distance from the forged transfers. Distance from the shell holdings. Distance from Cedric Ashbourne. That, Elias understood at once, was the beginning of real collapse. Not when powerful men were accused. When their allies began calculating survival faster than loyalty. Percival Dorn fared worse. He had not spoken much in the hall. Fear had shrunk him. But fear does not end when proceedings do. It ripens. Once a man like Dorn understands he has not backed power, but merely rented it, terror changes shape. By nightfall, he was already under quiet watch. Elias and Ashcroft met in a private room away from the hall. "You hurt him," Ashcroft said. "Not enough," Elias replied. "That depends," Ashcroft said dryly, "on whether you mistake injury for conclusion." Because the truth was simple. Cedric had not fallen yet. He had been cut, exposed, forced off balance in public. But men like Cedric Ashbourne were not destroyed in a single afternoon. "What now?" Elias asked. "Now the room divides," Ashcroft said. "The weak flee. The clever deny. The frightened speak.
Cedric will try to contain the damage and throw blame downward. Dorn, Elias said. Among others. That was the hinge. If Dorn believed Cedric could still shield him, he would stay loyal. If he believed Cedric was already reaching for a knife to place in his back, he would begin to bargain. By midnight, the first report had already come. Dorn had requested private counsel, then changed his mind, then asked whether Ashcroft's office intended to distinguish between principal offenders and cooperating witnesses. He is cracking, Elias said. He is thinking, Ashcroft corrected, which is often the more useful stage. Percival Dorn did not break all at once. He began with caution, with half-truths, with the hope that cooperation might be offered without confession. By dawn, he understood the truth. Cedric Ashbourne was already preparing to survive without him. That realization did more than fear ever could. When Dorn was brought into a private chamber under Ashcroft's supervision, he still carried what remained of his dignity. He asked whether the office intended to distinguish between principal offenders and cooperating parties.
"That depends," Ashcroft said, "on whether you intend to correct the record or merely decorate it." At first, Dorn tried to narrow the damage. He admitted that certain schedules had been shared, that internal Whitford timing had reached commercial interests outside the company, that some papers had been redirected before filing. Then Ashcroft placed a letter on the table. A routing mark, an account connection tying one of Dorn's discrete payments to a legal intermediary already linked to Cedric's network. The last of Dorn's posture collapsed. When he spoke again, he did so more quietly and more honestly. Yes, Cedric's circle had placed him. Yes, the recommendation that brought him into Whitford's orbit had been arranged. Yes, he had provided internal schedules, draft property information, and operational timing. Yes, Cedric had wanted to know where Whitford was strongest, where he was vulnerable, and how quickly certain holdings could be destabilized if their founder were removed. Then Ashcroft asked the question that mattered most. The attack itself. What do you know? Dorn hesitated, then said, "I knew there would be action that night if Lord Ashbourne concluded the risk had become immediate." And why was the risk immediate? Because Mr. Whitford had become economically difficult to contain, because he had begun tracing the tax and property structures, and because Lord Ashbourne believed that if he were given more time, especially with your support, my lord, he would become impossible to silence lawfully. That was it. Not jealousy, not rivalry, not a business quarrel turned ugly. A political and financial execution dressed as necessity. By noon, the first wave moved. Orders were issued quickly. Men from the Crown Office and local authorities searched Cedric's residence and related offices. Locked desks were opened. Private cabinets were examined. Correspondence boxes were seized. Ledgers hidden behind more innocent ledgers were pulled into light. At the same time, secondary searches were executed against offices linked to the merchant houses Dorn had named. By evening, reports began returning. A sealed packet of duplicate property drafts, private letters linking Cedric's office to transfer timing that should never have been discussed before Whitford's declared death. A ledger of disbursements whose recipients matched names Dorn had already given. A memorandum discussing the need to prepare administrative transition upon the removal of a destabilizing commercial actor. Placed together, the structure was complete. Cedric Ashbourne was formally charged before sunset. The language came layered first: fraud, conspiracy, falsification of ownership instruments, obstruction, inducement of unlawful filings. But beneath it, everyone understood the deeper thing now pressing behind the legal wording. The attack on Elias Whitford had been no accident. When news reached Elias that Cedric had been formally charged, he stood by the table where the last of the reports lay open and looked down at them in silence. Dorn had spoken. Ashcroft had moved. Cedric's house had been opened like a locked chest. The papers had been found. The charges had been filed. The pieces had locked together. Cedric was trapped inside the truth. Cedric Ashbourne was sentenced to death. His titles were stripped. His estates were seized. His accounts were opened and broken apart. The merchant houses tied to his network were fined, exposed, or dismantled. Clerks, intermediaries, and accomplices received the punishment their roles had earned. At last, the law spoke against the man who had long believed it existed to protect men like him. Elias did not attend every proceeding. He had no appetite left for spectacle. Only one thing remained for him. On a gray morning, Elias went alone to Clara's grave. He stood there a long time without speaking, then at last said, "It is done." His voice was quiet, not triumphant, only tired. "I could not give you the life I promised," he said, "but I did not let them bury the truth with you." He lowered his head once, then turned and left. That afternoon he went to the prison where Cedric was being held. The guards led him through iron gates and narrow stone corridors until they stopped outside the final cell. Inside, Cedric sat on the bench with the last scraps of his pride wrapped around him like a coat. When he saw Elias, he rose. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Cedric said, "So this is victory to you." Elias stood still beyond the bars. "No," he said, "this is consequence." Cedric's mouth tightened. "Men like you always mistake survival for worth." "And men like you," Elias said, "always mistake inheritance for merit." Cedric stepped closer to the bars. "Power belongs to those born to carry it." "No," Elias answered. "Power belongs to those strong enough to earn it." Cedric gave a cold smile. If that were true, the world would belong to servants. Elias did not look away. It would belong to the people who built it. A beat of silence passed. Then Cedric said, lower now, "That is why your kind is dangerous. You make common men believe they are equal." Elias answered without raising his voice, "They are equal. What terrifies men like you is the day they stop asking permission to rise." Cedric said nothing. Elias looked at him one last time. "You were born above other men, and still never learned how to stand taller than them." Then he turned and walked away. Cedric did not call after him. The final gate opened. Elias stepped out into the cold evening air. Behind him were iron, stone, and the ruins of a world that had tried to erase him. Ahead was something quieter. Not peace, not yet, but an end to pursuit. He closed his hand around Clara's ring, and walked forward without turning back.